So let's pick up where we left off. Now that we know the reason behind the news addiction, let's explore what I'd like to call stressformation, which is basically stress-inducing information. There are 5 types of information that I've come across that induce stress. And the 5 types are excessive, negative, inaccurate, inactionable, and initiating. So let's dive into the first type, excessive information. What I'm referring to is what everybody calls information overload. But what's happening right now is that the information overload is being magnified. And the reason for that is that it's not only about the information we are receiving, but the information we are seeking as well. We are seeking information to feel safe, and we are seeking information to find hope. Another way to describe this vicious cycle is that we are chasing what is chasing us. And that is magnifying the information overload massively. And here's the thing. When we are overloaded, we are overwhelmed. And when we are overwhelmed, we are no longer in control. Because what's coming our way is beyond what we believe we can handle. When we feel a loss of control, we no longer feel safe. And in the absence of safety, we feel threatened. And in the presence of a perceived threat, we feel stress. You see, to me, stress is the perceived absence of safety. Now, before we move on, let me share with you the link between decisions and stress. The higher the number of decisions we have to make, the faster our mental energy is depleted, the higher our sensitivity to stress-inducing triggers around us. And when we are receiving huge amounts of information, with every piece of information we receive comes a series of decisions that need to be made, conscious and unconscious, about whether to write it down or record it, share it with others or keep it to yourself, whether or not to apply it, how to apply it, and so on. There are a lot of decisions attached to a single piece of information, so minimizing the number of decisions we make on a daily basis as much as possible will allow us to conserve our mental energy and reduce our sensitivity to stress. And one way to do that is to reduce the amount of information we are receiving. But that is a video for another day. So let's move on to the second type, negative information. And just to be clear, I'm referring to information that induces negative emotions. And if you take a step back and think about the information you are receiving from the news, you'll begin to notice that most of the information triggers negative emotions. I mean, think about it. When was the last time you watched the news and felt frustrated, ashamed, guilty, resentful, angry, enraged, furious, sad, hurt, disappointed, or anxious? Was it a long time ago? Or was it today? Just something to think about. And one thing to point out here is that all negative emotions stem from fear. And that's why when we feel fear, directly or indirectly through another emotion, we feel stress. Now let's move on to the third type, inaccurate information. And I think it's important to clarify that what I'm referring to is information that is actually inaccurate or information that is perceived as inaccurate. This type is mainly linked to social media information, because that's the type of information that usually leads to social conflict manifesting in the form of never-ending arguments among family, friends, and colleagues. Now here's the thing. Whenever we receive information that we are uncertain about, we experience inner conflict. And that conflict is between what we are receiving and what we already know. And just to be clear, it is our resistance to that information that creates the conflict. And whenever we resist, we create mental and physical tension that suggests to the unconscious mind the existence of a threat. And on top of that, whenever we resist, we create a mental block that prevents us from accessing our inner resources, including problem solving and creativity. And in the presence of that block is when we feel trapped, stuck, and paralyzed. That's when we feel threatened, and that's when we feel stress. The fourth type is inactionable information. When it comes to the news, we are passive receivers of information we cannot use. In most cases, it provides us with information we cannot apply. It mainly shares what's happening, but rarely shares what we can do about it. And what that does is it reinforces a state of powerlessness, hopelessness, helplessness, and uselessness. As a result, we feel paralyzed, victimized, and trapped. And ultimately, we feel a loss of control. The danger here is that we experience this in a very subtle way that we are not consciously aware of. Which brings me to the final type: initiating information. And what I mean by that is information that creates open loops in our minds. Now, I'm going to talk about open loops on a future video, but for now, I'd like to share the link between open loops and stress. So to start off, one way to describe open loops is that it's a thought that needs resolving. Now, in communication, there are two ways to create open loops in the minds of people: questions and statements. One thing to remember about the mind is that it cannot avoid a question. And the question you ask yourself is even harder to avoid. That happens when you hear a statement that triggers a question in your mind. That's why making statements is a stealthier way to create open loops in the minds of people when compared to just asking questions. So for example, if we hear a statement like, "we are in danger," that's going to trigger a series of questions in our minds, including, we are in danger of what? What's the cause of this danger? What would happen if it takes place? Is it actually going to happen? When will it happen? Is there something we can do about it? What can we do about it? Can we prevent it? How can we prevent it? And the list goes on. And here's the thing. Each of these questions creates an open loop that needs to be closed. But why do we need to close them? By the way, I just asked a question that created an open loop in your mind that can only be closed by providing you with an answer to that question. Do you see how this works? Here's what's interesting. I just asked another question, but the difference is that this final question is a yes or no question, which either means that it doesn't create an open loop, or even if it does, it's one that you can easily close. So before I get back to answering the question, I'd like to clarify this. Any statement has the potential to trigger questions, but the more powerful the statement is, the more questions it triggers. And the most powerful type of statement to do so is the negatively charged one. And to be clear, I'm referring to statements that are charged with negative emotions. The example I used falls into that category. And the reason why these statements are so powerful is because a negatively charged statement will be perceived by the unconscious mind as a threat. And as a result, the unconscious mind will trigger as many questions as possible for us to answer in order for us to cover all angles to avoid that threat and feel safe. The news is a perfect example of this, with one additional feature. It has the power to provide us with statements that trigger questions that we cannot answer and create open loops that we cannot close. And the reason for that is that the news is a machine that is designed to be a never-ending story. It thrives on the lack of resolution and the lack of closure. Which brings me back to the unanswered question. Why do we need to close open loops? 3 reasons come to mind. 1, incompetence. Whenever we are unable to close an open loop, we feel incompetent. And whenever we feel incompetent, we feel a loss of control, which gives birth to stress. 2, overwhelm. As I had previously mentioned, an open loop can be described as an unresolved thought. An unresolved thought is perceived by the unconscious mind as a micro-threat. Now, the problem is not in the presence of a micro-threat, it's in the excessive number of micro-threats. And if we're not mindful, it would be very easy for a compounding effect to take place, which would lead to a generalized state of feeling threatened and feeling overwhelmed by the sheer number of micro-threats. And like I said earlier, whenever we feel overwhelmed, we no longer feel in control. 3, fear. The more questions we have, the more open loops we create. The more unknowns we give birth to, the more we amplify the fear of the unknown. Especially when the questions we have are negatively charged because they were triggered by negatively charged statements. And let's not forget that the fear of the unknown is one of the 4 types of fear we are experiencing on a regular basis. And like I said earlier, the more fear we experience, the more stress we feel. One final point to make. There are different types of stress, but to keep it simple, I chose to focus only on the stress that doesn't serve us. It is the hypersensitive, hyperstimulated fight or flight response that we have unintentionally and unwillingly enabled ourselves to experience that needs to stop, that needs to be tamed, retuned, reconditioned. And that begins with awareness. On my next video, I will share the 4 rules that we can use to protect ourselves from stress-inducing information. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, please make sure to like and subscribe. And if there are any topics you'd like me to talk about, please share them in the comment section below. I wish you an amazing morning, evening, afternoon, night, wherever you are. Bye for now.